Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to look at Paul and his dad once Jim got married. Paul and his brother Mike liked that his father began a new life in his retirement by marrying a younger lady named Angie. She had a daughter named Ruth, and I imagine Jim felt like he was turning into a younger man again. Paul and Mike were glad that their dad found happiness once again, and Jim decided to adopt Ruth, and Paul and Mike were glad for their dad and his new family. Jim continued his tradition of having his sons look up words in the dictionary, but this time it was Ruth who looked up the words. She learned about his words of wisdom, such as "do it now," and "there's no hair on a seagull's chest," and "put it there if it weighs a ton." Paul was always great with kids and would play games with Ruth in the garden, or would show her books with his favorite contemporary artists. Paul wasn't as close to Angie as Mike was, but he liked her good humor and her hospitality when he would bring guests to the house. When Paul stayed at the house with Jim and his family, Jim treated his son the way he always did. He would ask him if he was eating right and if his bowels were regular. The other Beatles had parents or relatives that treated them with reverence because they were famous. So Angie got Jim out of his pinstripe business suits and into more casual clothes, and Paul would bring George or John with him to his dad's house. George loved Jim's food, and his favorite thing that Jim made was custard. George would always ask him for the recipe, but Jim never gave it to him, according to Angie. John was also a frequent guest. He liked to spend time with Ruth. According to her, he taught her how to ride her bike, and he also would read to her, and he would make up stories about her teddy bear. Now Paul buys a house. In 1965, Paul bought a house on Cavendish Avenue. It had to be refurbished, so he couldn't move in till 1966. Jane lived with him, and she was an excellent cook, and she was also a great hostess, and Jim was a frequent guest. Jane taught Ruth how to cook, sew, and crochet, and sometimes Jim felt out of place at Paul's. One year, Jane had her and Paul's family tree done, and Jane Asher's dated back to the reign of King James, and the McCartneys only went back to the 19th century, a dirt-poor farmer in Ireland. So Jim was upset when the Beatles broke up. Paul and the rest of the Beatles weren't the only ones upset by the breakup of the Beatles. To Jim, John and George were still the lads who used to practice in a small living room and eat his cooking. He didn't see how they went from such friendships to hatred. Jim at this time was dealing with rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. He also got shingles at this time, which made his arthritis worse. So Angie made sure he didn't watch the news reports because it made things worse too. All the remedies and treatments Jim got didn't stop the arthritis, but Jim was determined to keep his enjoyment of life. He loved the 3 granddaughters he had from Paul, and he also had 3 granddaughters from his son Mike, and he would play with them like he did with Paul and Mike and Ruth, and they would climb on his knees, Angie said, and it hurt him, but he never let it show. And Jim loved his racehorse. The racehorse that Paul gave Jim was his great love. The horse was named Drake's Drum, and it won several important races. And when the horse's racing career declined and Jim wasn't able to travel the way he used to, Paul moved the horse to a stable that was just a mile from Jim and Angie's place. And Angie would drive him there once a week to feed a horse sugar lumps, and then they would go to the beach to see him train. So Jim continued to visit Paul. Even when his condition was getting worse, Jim still made his way to see Paul and Linda at Cavendish, and he would do this around Christmas time. Sometimes his favorite sisters, Jen and Millie, would be there too. Paul would have a special treat, and one time they went to the Ritz Hotel for afternoon tea. Sometimes Jim would make the 300-mile journey to High Park Farm, and he would say to Angie, "Here we go on the long and winding road." And the farm wasn't as fancy as the Cavendish house. They would spend the night in the garage. Paul said he had it fixed up for him, and Angie said they slept on a mattress on the floor, and the girls slept inside the house in bunk beds. Linda was loved by Angie and Jim, but she was possessive of him. If Paul was driving them somewhere, Linda would automatically jump in the front seat next to Paul when it should have been his father. So Jim in the early 1970s, Jim was in his 70s and his health was declining, and he was still dealing with his rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. He also had bronchial problems due to his lifelong smoking. The house that Paul bought for his dad, Jim could no longer afford to live there because of his mobility. So Paul bought the house back from Jim, and they moved to a more convenient bungalow in Beverly Drive. Paul started to visit his dad in London wearing shoes caked in mud from the farm. His dad thought he looked scruffy, and he lent him his hush puppy suede ones. It caught on at the studio, and soon other people were wearing hush puppies too. In 1976, Jim's condition took a turn for the worst. Angie had been caring for him with the help of her teenage daughter. When he couldn't leave his bed, Jim's sisters, Jen and Millie, said he should be put in a care home, saying Paul would pay for everything. Jim, though, had made her promise that he would die in his own bed. Paul and Mike wanted what their dad did, so Angie and Ruth began around-the-clock care. Ruth said there was nothing wrong with his mind. He would sit up in bed in the middle of the night and say he fancied an onion or a tin of Cross and Blackwell barley soup. She said her or her mom would go get it for him. Paul drove up in early March to see his dad. He was getting ready to fly to Europe with wings. Angie said he brought Jim a photograph of himself with Linda and the kids, and Jim put it beside the bed. When Paul left, he told Angie, as he put his arms around her, "I'll never forget what you've done for my dad, Angie. You'll never want for anything again." So Jim died of bronchial pneumonia on March the 18th. His last thoughts were of his wife Mary, who died 20 years earlier. He whispered to Angie, "I'll be with Mary soon." So Jim's funeral was on March 22nd. Paul was in Copenhagen and didn't return home for the funeral. He didn't have a show that day, and with a private jet, it would have been easy for him to get there, but he didn't go. And John Lennon learned of Jim's death and called Paul to tell him. And then Mike said he wasn't surprised that Paul wasn't at the funeral. It was no coincidence that Paul was on the continent at the time. Paul would never face that sort of thing. And then commenting on his father, Mike McCartney said, "My dad taught me a lot of things. We both owe him a lot. He was a very good man, and he's a very stubborn man, and he looks more like Paul than me, but I got him inside me." Of course, it would have been easy for him to have gone off with other birds when Mum died, or gone out getting drunk every night, but he didn't. He stayed at home and looked after us. So next, Angie upsets the family. After Jim died, Angie continued to live at the bungalow, and soon after the funeral, Angie and Ruth went to Spain on vacation. They had been Jim's caregiver around the clock, and they felt like they needed a rest, but that didn't sit well with the McCartneys. So Angie was in her late 40s when she became a widow for the second time. She made a bad business move with a partnership and a theatrical agency. It was a failure. Paul didn't try to rescue the agency, and she soon lost the bungalow because the bungalow was mortgaged to fund the agency. After that, Angie and Ruth moved to London. They did a total of 5 low-paying jobs between them, and then even worse, their rented flat had a burglary, taking their valuables. Angie was short on money, and she did a story to the Sun newspaper, and without her permission, they had a title for the story, "The Mean Side of Paul McCartney." Angie had some of Jim's souvenirs, and Paul was mad when he thought that she had sold his birth certificate to an American collector, but it turns out the birth certificate was a copy. Ruth, with Paul's encouragement, had some success as a singer-songwriter, and she signed with Jupiter BMG Records and released an album, "I Will Always Remember," to the memory of Jim. Angie never remarried, and her daughter Ruth stayed together, living in Germany, Australia, and the American West Coast. And they launched a multimedia company with Ruth's third husband, a producer. While Angie, at the time of Philip Norman's book, Paul McCartney, was in her 80s and full of life, so I'm not sure if she's still alive, but she had a line of organic teas named Mrs. McCartney and a daily blog. And she and Paul never spoke after the 1970s. She had watched him from afar, and she called Jim Jimmy Mac and said that Jimmy Mac would be proud of him. Paul and his brother had a great father and mother, and Paul's dad was a great influence in his life and encouraged Paul to do music. And a commenter in one of my videos said that if his mother had lived, Paul wouldn't have gotten into music, and that's probably true, because I think the same thing was said in the book Paul McCartney. So Jim had a zest for life, loved music, and most of all loved his family. Paul got his musical abilities from his dad, and he learned from his father how to be an exceptional father himself. As Angie said, Jim would be proud of Paul and all he has accomplished. So I hope everybody liked the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it will help me see if I'm going in the right direction with my videos. So I wish everybody a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.